Hey everybody, today we're going to start to talk about fractions. And fractions are just a way to describe an amount. And you're used to whole number amounts, I bet. I mean, when you were little, someone had you counting Cheerios. And they would count 1, 2, 3, right? And then you would learn, oh, that's 3. And you learned that this amount is 3. And then you could think about 3 years, $3, 3 pieces of candy. You learned that amount. And you found that we described that amount like that. 3, that's 3. Those are whole numbers. That's a whole number. But what I bet someone didn't have you do when you're little was count maybe a piece of Cheerio that was broken off. I bet they just swept that aside when you were little and had you count the whole Cheerios. But that's an amount of a Cheerio, isn't it? We have to have some way to describe that amount. So if I asked you what that amount of Cheerio was, I bet a lot of you would already say, oh, Miss Wessel, that looks like 1/2 of a Cheerio. And you would be exactly right. Well, where did that come from? How did you know that it was 1/2? Well, let's think about it. Probably you saw that it would take 2 of that amount to create a whole Cheerio. And that is where the denominator comes from. The denominator, the number down below the line in a fraction, is the denominator, and it tells how many of that part, the part it takes to make a whole. And in this case, it would take 2 of this amount. And it should be exact, but when we're drawing models, it's difficult to get them to look exactly alike. So we just have to trust that when we're talking about fractional amounts, we're talking about the exact 2 of that exact amount what it would take to make a whole. So the number on the bottom is called the denominator, and it's really a label that tells you what the unit is. The unit in this case is called a half, and it means that it takes 2 of that amount to make the whole. And the number on the top is the numerator, which tells us how many of those halves or units, how many of those units we are talking about or trying to describe. I'm trying to describe 1/2 of a Cheerio to you. All right, so let's take that on as we look at these 2 models. Now you can have a fraction of anything. I can have a fraction of a day, right? Part of a day. I can sing a fraction of a song, not the whole thing. You can watch a fraction of a television show, or you can eat a fraction of a candy bar, right? There's so many different ways and things that we can describe in fractional amounts. But we like to draw models just so we have something visual to look at. And in this model, they're both divided or partitioned into 3 parts. But if I was going to color one of the parts in each of the models, only one of those could be called 1/3. And can you tell which one it would be? Well, there's 3 parts in this whole, and there's one of them. And there's 3 parts in this whole, and there's one of them. But only one of those colored in portions has the right or can be called a third. If you picked this one, you're exactly right. Why is that amount able to be called a third? Because it takes 3 of that amount to make the whole. It doesn't take 3 of this amount to create this whole model, does it? But right here, this one can be called a third because it takes 3 of that amount to make the whole. That's where we get the denominator from. Now, if I wanted to describe this exact amount that's colored in, I'd say I have one of those 3 parts that make the whole. The third is a unit describing the amount that it takes. So the third and one of them. This would be described as a unit fraction, really just because it shows us one of the unit, right? One of this type of unit, 1/3. Now, if I wanted to describe this amount, there's still thirds, right? That's still a third. And remember that, so I'm not saying 3 there. It's a third. It's a word. Think of that as a word, third. We just write it as a 3 for a shortcut. But remember, that's a sort of a label telling you what units we're working with. And the top number, the numerator, will tell me how many of those I'm specifically trying to describe. So this is called a unit fraction because it's showing one of the type of unit we're working with. But if I can also show that I have two of that unit, and that would be 2/3. So let's be thinking, whenever we see a fraction, I want you to focus in on that denominator and remind yourself, oh, that's telling me how many parts it takes to make a whole. And the numerator is telling me how many of those units or how many of those halves are being described at the moment. Okay, let's keep that in mind as we go forward.